Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for lending us your time today. Welcome to our webinar, 50 Shades of Email Security. This webinar will cover what targeted email attacks look like today, what legacy email security can and cannot do, and best practices on building an effective email security stack. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we begin. Please type in any questions that you may have in the Q&A section of the Zoom webinar console. We'll try answering as many as possible live during the webinar. If not, after the webinar is over, our panelists will take as many questions as time permits. Registrants will receive a recording of the webinar, the slides, and other related resources within 24 hours, so keep an eye out for that. And without further ado, I'm now delighted to welcome our webinar presenters. You'll soon see that I'm very lucky to be a floating head beside them for this session. We're joined today by Jim Rutt, Chief Information Officer at Dana Foundation, and Rob Fry, Chief Technology Officer at Armorblox. I'll pass it over to Jim and then Rob to introduce themselves more fully and get started with the webinar. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Abby. Once again, my name is Jim Rutt. I'm the CIO of the Dana Foundation. The Dana Foundation is an endowment-based foundation that funds grants for neuroscience, neuroimmunology, brain research, and brain awareness, along with a number of different outreach programs regarding the brain and brain science.
And I'm Rob Fry. I'm the CTO here at Armorblox, where we do email messaging and online drive security. Happy to be here.
I am. So do we want to get started, Abby?
Yes, Jim, over to you.
Okay. Well, good afternoon from the East Coast, everybody. I'm happy to be here with Rob and Abby to discuss the ever-changing landscape, in terms of email attacks, email vector attacks, et cetera. As the slide shows right here, we're constantly evolving in terms of seeing different types of vectors of attack, different approaches, different ways to kind of to look at these things. And I think this graph is perfect in understanding. If you look from 2013 up till 2019, we see a pretty gradual slope up in terms of the type, intensity, and number of attacks. I think it's safe to say moving into 2020, we're going to see the angle on that chart move even higher based on what we've seen, generally in the news. I think the complexity of the attacks, the number of them, the pernicious nature of all these attacks are incredible. And I think once we get into some of the details here on this slide, we're all going to see this. So I'll just make a couple of quick points on each one of these blue points on the slide. The first one is back in around 2013, 2014, there was an attack out of Lithuania that had to do with several bank accounts out of Latvia and Cyprus. This guy stole about 100 million through using fake invoices, pretending to be a company called Quanta Computer. It was a hardware company based in Taiwan that did business with Google and Facebook. It's a very interesting kind of angle in terms of trying to attack. The second point, back in 2016, the FBI started tracking business email compromises in 2013. They witnessed a 1,300% increase in identified exposed losses totaling $3 billion using those types of BEC scams. So we're starting to see, as we go along, the complexity of these attacks are getting a little more pernicious. 2017, the WireWire attack, where our federal authorities announced a coordinated attempt to start to disrupt these schemes. It was conducted over a 6-month period, culminating over 2 weeks of intensified law enforcement activity, resulting in about 74 arrests across the United States and some other countries, including Nigeria and Poland, et cetera. The operation also resulted in the seizure of about $2.4 million and put a kind of a stop or halted a number of different wire transfers that were in process as a result of those attacks. The fourth point is the AIG reporting business email compromises, replacing ransomware, data breaches, in terms of claims for cyber insurance. Now, there's a lot of confusion about cyber insurance in general. I think this is kind of the go-to claim seeing as though these types of attacks, particularly ransomware, are starting to increase. Concordantly, the FBI is starting to upgrade these types of losses, at least the forecast of these losses, up towards $26 billion. So this is up to 2019. Looking generally at the types of attacks and breach disclosures that we've seen so far in 2020, we can see that this trend is not going to stop anytime soon. And this is something that's going to take even more focus in terms of being able to mitigate and control. So generally what we're seeing, as we've shown on the slide here, is that adversaries are using more intense types of impersonation, varying types of social engineering, and other human-focused as opposed to simply textual focus to steal money, data, any valuable assets. So Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, I think my simple thoughts is that the line keeps going up and to the right because it's a very successful attack. That you have to have an appreciation for the creativeness of the adversary and their ability to circumvent existing legacy systems.
Yeah, fantastic. Abby, next slide, please. So historically, when we talk about email attacks, we basically think about the stuff that we've seen, generally speaking, over the past 10 years. Simple spam attacks, simple phishing emails that most of us could probably spot visually right away. The bottom line is most of the classic security controls like that are built into Office 365, G Suite, and the like, they've done a good job of effectively mitigating these types of attacks. I think we're all familiar with them. I think this is more or less a table stakes requirement for most of these controls, for most of these suites in terms of the native security that they build in. Moving forward into present day, as I've mentioned before, these types of attacks are getting more complex. The outlook is a lot more mixed when we talk about targeted email attacks. So we've got a few here. The ones that are really starting to become more voluminous, they're more, we've seen a lot more of them that are very difficult to rely solely on native controls are VIP impersonation, where you have an executive in your team that a malicious entity is wishing to personify and send emails on behalf of that person, hoping to glean data, money, credentials, etc. Vendor fraud, which is particularly pernicious in the areas of banks, shipping companies like FedEx and UPS, where again, the ultimate goal is to gain valuable credentials and or account data that can be used for monetary gain. Credential phishing, kind of along the same lines. Account takeover, that's more or less a byproduct of the ones above, where those credentials, where those that critical data is being used to subsume control of some of these accounts. Now, the critical thing to reiterate here is that these are not just taking classical variables from typical email approaches. So they're more unique vectors, techniques, payloads, things that are more psychometric in my mind to kind of approach more or less a strategic plan by these bad actors to gain the critical information that they so desire. Most controls, again, as we spoke about earlier, more or less on and off, kind of binary approach. Either it matches a certain word or it matches a certain bad email, and it doesn't take into account a lot of the subtextual elements that I'll talk about in very shortly. Rob, anything to add there?
I think you're hitting it. The phishing, doesn't describe one type of attack anymore. I think we all remember the days where it kind of did. I think what kind of stands out from this is the third, fourth, and fifth attacks. So VIP impersonation, payroll fraud, vendor fraud. Those are essentially the payload is the language. So they're language-based attacks. And even the last two, while they still might have a fake attachment or a ODay URL, it's still the language inside of it that's actually trying to get the attention of the user.
Excellent. All right, next slide, please, Abby. So I think the general consensus is here is that we need to shift from locating standardized variables that, like I talked about, a certain piece of text, a certain email, a certain variable of types, to understanding the subtle subtext of the emails and how they resonate with the receiver. So there's three kind of key areas that we have to take into account in order to be able to be successful in approaching this, again, from from more or less a psychometric kind of view. So from an authority perspective, we, generally as an person receiving an email from, say, an executive, we see uncertainty in general, because why are they sending us an email? What's the subject and the content of that email? So I think we're falling back on the certainty of that authority figure. So we feel more comfortable kind of in a knee-jerk reaction to respond to these folks quickly, and maybe not without fully parsing in our minds what the intent of the initial email message is. From an urgency perspective, I think we all kind of want to look at getting our list of to-dos down as quick as possible. Email is kind of an enabler of that. I mean, it's very easy to see an email and try to respond to it to get it off of our to-do list. So we want to get it behind us, shorten the amount of time needed to get that to-do list, and also to kind of get that specific request off of our list. Fear. We all worry about, the negative consequences, especially when an authority figure is involved. So we have a fear of negative repercussion. We're worried about not acting on an email in a timely manner. I think, we kind of worry about leaving something to the side and taking too much time to really process what's needed of us and how we should react. So in most cases, we're more willing to kind of respond very quickly, to get it off our list, and to feel like we are on top of things, quote unquote. So essentially, these types of subtextual approaches are aiming to trigger our base instincts, which we've laid out here before. And a lot of them, again, more psychological than they are logical, because most people are thinking more or less from an emotional intelligence perspective rather than a logical one. In which case, not fully thinking these things through, they can induce behavior vis-a-vis taking actions on these emails or responding to them that can induce a lot of harm. So, Rob, anything to add there?
Sorry, you said psychology, and I mean, this slide just screams psychology to me. I'm a big fan of studying psychology as it's related to cybersecurity. So I've done cognitive psychology. I've learned about prospect theory, which, if you don't know what prospect theory is, I think everybody in security should understand prospect theory. Social psychology, behavioral psychology, and conditioning. And we don't always kind of comprehend what's happening and what the power of it is until you kind of understand it and study it. So, hey, guess what? Adversary understands it. They're a lot better at it than us, and they experiment like crazy. They've been experimenting on us for a long time, and they do that because the reward is so high. And so from a phishing perspective, we essentially need to understand, how does this email sound to the receiver? What emotional response is it actually eliciting? Because guess what? That's what the adversary is doing. And so for us to be able to kind of counter it is our responsibility to essentially understand it and then detect it.
Well said. Okay.
And then from this email, I think we're all trained from a young age to listen, obey our parents or our bosses and anybody that's in a position of authority. We understand the pressures of stress and urgency and the negative consequences of what it feels like when there are deadlines or potentials to the potential of failing to meet them. And then fear, as we mentioned on the previous slide, one of those kind of primal emotions. If the adversary can craft an email that invokes any of these or all of these, they're typically going to win. And so when you look at this email right here, is an example of an email that actually got past legacy defenses. And so we actually posted a blog on it. So if you want to jump into the gritty details, you can go out to our page and read about it. But what's interesting is the position of authority in this one, in this example, is a bank. And we want to trust our banks because they hold our money. And the adversary did a very good job of impersonating Bank of America while inducing fear and urgency to make you believe that you're going to lose access to your money unless you validate that you are the owner of an email address. And this email passed the legacy controls because, one, it was sent from a Yahoo account via SendGrid, which allowed it to pass email authentication checks such as DMARC and DKIM and SPF. It also, additionally, it added believability by leading them to a realistic page to ask them security questions, which if you're going to do a validation, logically these days, you should be asked a security question, which is great, by the way, because it also allowed the adversary to harvest even more information that they could leverage or that they could sell. So there also was an ODay URL with the recent creation date, and so it was able to bypass all the known blacklists. And so the attempt was detected by essentially language models because there was an unusual aspect to the language because it indicated urgency. You have to do this now. But it also detected that Bank of America was represented, but the sender of the email was from Yahoo. Like, this is something simple. I think everybody here understands that. But there was also an interesting, if you think from a statistical perspective, there was no communication history between the user and the sender and the domain frequency between the sender and receiver of domains. It's all of which, if you think of kind of standard operating procedure, all normal communication patterns between customers and businesses, this one starts to logically become easy to detect.
Yeah, this is great stuff. And I'd like to add also, because all those points, I think you never underestimate the power of branding. I think I mentioned before, like banks, like shipping companies, et cetera, something well known will induce quicker responses as well. That doesn't help our efforts in trying to mitigate attacks that really are very subtle and resembling, legitimate messaging, I would say, towards an end user. So all these things together, very tough to approach, I would say, without without taking into account all these variables. So what we have here is an example of an email attack that got past some of these legacy defenses that we have talked about before. So we've got a number of items highlighted here. The first one is, from a VIP impersonation type attack, which I discussed before, which is some executive in your organization or trying to impersonate an executive in your organization to induce a specific action to release sensitive data. In pink here, it says, can you please run over to the Safeway that's opposite our headquarters and buy iTunes gift cards, right? So, this kind of request is very intense. It's got a time deadline, inducing some of that urgency that we talked about as well. Also on the second line, I need, that implies or imputes a lot of urgency there, very sharp. Within the next 2 hours, giving a specific time deadline. And then the highlight there, reimbursing, indicating that, taking this action, there's a financial aspect to it, obviously, from both ends. So the attack type, VIP impersonation, as we talked about, the vector sent through a Yahoo account, and attack payload is a request for the gift cards. Anything else, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I like it. I think the way I kind of look at this is in my past when I was on the customer side, I'd do some really smart threat researchers who would essentially do language forensics on these types of things. And this is essentially what they would also come up with. So it's interesting from that particular aspect. So Abby, for the next slide. Now this is another example of a simple, powerful attack. So there's no URL. There's none of the things that we're used to seeing. It's essentially an adversary just saying, hey, you know what, my direct deposit information, I need to change it, with the intention of essentially tricking the person in the payroll department to actually update it so that the person's next paycheck goes to the adversary instead of coming to you. But this is another example of how language can be used as a signal in detecting phishing attempts and kind of helping protect that human layer. Jim, as a CISO, like when you see this, like what are your impressions?
When I see this type of attack, I would say it scares the living daylights out of me, number one. Because, from my perspective, having seen these things historically, I would look at it with a lot more practiced vision. Most of our end users, though, you constantly have to keep up with how they're going to be able to consume this and understand, to look at the whole thing rather than the sum of its parts.
And so on the next slide, we'll start going through some of the kind of the gaps in legacy email security. We can start to lay some of the groundwork where we currently are working on. So some companies have stayed on-prem. Some companies are 100% cloud. I think for a majority of customers, though, they're in a hybrid mode, and then that's okay. There's flexibility. It gives a business, more options, depending on what their business vertical is. So you're a tech company, you're going to be in Gmail, you're going to be in O365. If you're maybe in the utility industry, government sector, on-prem is kind of the thing for you. But it also makes securing email a little bit more challenging. So these days, your email security solutions need to be flexible. I think a lot of the solutions that you've seen, they're kind of built for a day. Does anybody remember, like, for instance, when you had to log into VPN in order to get access to email? Because I still remember those days. Like, we didn't have these handheld things. You had to have a laptop. You got on VPN, and that's how you got email. You didn't have it unless you were on VPN, which I wish we could go back to those days, but it's hard to handle. So what you see here essentially is there's gaps. And there's an ability to essentially make changes and kind of augment the native security in order to be successful. So Jim, what are your thoughts on this?
So yeah, Rob, I think that as a matter of best practice, it's always a good idea to add some kind of a third-party augmentation, third-party service to the native security controls as they are, because, not just from a lot of folks will battle you in terms of thinking, why spend the extra cost if there's already controls embedded within the tenancy of the main email service. But, from a number of perspectives, chiefly speaking, I would say it's always great to have a check and balance against those native controls, besides supplementing those native controls. Because it's kind of like having defense in depth from a network perspective. You don't rely solely on one layer of defense in a traditional, perimeter style network. You rely on a number of different controls, most likely with some vendor diversity. So it's always a great idea to supplement what you have. Knowing, even though these native controls are improving, they're becoming more feature-filled. They're still not really a big focus from the email providers themselves, and that's why we should always be looking at supplemental or augmentative third-party controls.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's all right. So here, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about those specific native controls, primarily within Office 365. Seems to be the dominant email service as of now. Some of the strengths of those native areas in EOP and ATP, right? Anti-spam, anti-malware, mail routing and flow rules. I would kind of encapsulate all three of those as table stakes. I think at this point, if your email provider doesn't have that, you've got a bigger issue than simply augmenting some native controls. Getting a little more, I would say, nuanced are some of these others in ATP, like scanning attachments for unknown malware, kind of zero-day-ish control, time of click URL protection, where it's more or less like a quasi-sandboxing of those emails, which can bring their own challenges as well. Mass phishing campaigns to try to detect somebody that's just, finger blasting everybody with the same kind of campaign. So all these, we went from kind of table stakes to a little bit more advanced, a little more selective, to looking at the what we see as the gaps in those native controls. We've talked a number of times, Rob and I, about business email compromise. Very psychometric, very complex, not easily identified by just some simple variables. The pernicious nature of social engineered email attacks, vendor fraud, and attacks based on invoices. We see more and more of these, not easily picked up by your traditional anti-spam and anti-malware controls. phishing and abuse mailbox automation, an easy way to kind of get that binary workload out of your hands, try to automate some of these things. Zero-day credential phishing attacks, difficult enough if you know threat intelligence pretty well, even harder if you're not in that game, to see the different, the improvement, I would say, of these malicious attempts to fake these kind of login screens and gain those credentials clandestinely. And then all the time and all the effort that we've spent, configuring policies, configuring whitelists and allow lists and blacklists and block lists and what have you, we need a way to kind of do it better, I would say. I think, natively it's been a given. You're going to have to spend this amount of time in managing these things. I think more and more folks are looking for something that works a lot smarter in general. So, Rob, anything that I missed there? Anything to add?
Yeah, I think for me, like when I look at this slide, like I think there's an interesting parallel that I'm drawn to, and that it's the email provider's primary job to provide you with a highly functional and reliable service. And where that resonates with me is that in a past life, I worked for a company. We were a very early public cloud adopter with AWS. And so essentially, they were also there to provide you a highly functional, reliable service. Your operational security of it was not the problem. We understood that really from the very, very beginning. And we countered that by being a very innovative company and building security controls. And so I think it's important to understand that your native email providers, they have access to certain data sets like anti-spam, anti-malware, where they just have billions of data sets coming in on a daily basis. It's something that they should provide, and you see this from the public cloud providers too. They're actually starting to provide, some simple type of security services. But operational security is hard, and I think that this is what's allowed kind of the third-party email security market to open up, just like there's a third-party cloud security companies as well.
Yeah, great points. Okay. Oh, am I up? Oh. So again, kind of looking at some of the gaps in some of the what I would call legacy secure email gateways that have been available on the market. Very weak protection against these types of targeted attacks. In most cases, they will duplicate some of the controls that we've seen in the native areas. Very, I would say, intrusive kind of approach in terms of having to modify your mail exchanger records, rerouting. Very difficult to do this kind of on the fly and do it in such a way where your end user is not going to see any kind of impact to either delivery of those emails or any kind of modifications to the contents thereof. There's really not a lot of internal email protection, intra-organization, and understanding how these things can be leveraged to gain lateral movement, enhanced privilege, etc. And then again, these policy configurations that are taking our staffs a tremendous amount of time really doesn't enhance, and as a matter of fact, it sometimes adds to the workload of these things.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, this slide is it really speaks to the challenges. Targeted attacks are hard. I think we need to talk about, SCGs. They were built for a world that looked different than what we have today. I'm sure, we've all felt the challenges additionally of policy configuration or heard of somebody who's had issues with them exchanges or, introducing essentially the risk of a single point of failure and possibly affecting the business. So, these were state of the art when they came out. There's better ways to do this these days.
Yeah, not to mention as well, the complexities of having an out-of-band or inline device, as we've seen classically with these. I mean, they could bring a whole host of other issues, not least of which could be a simple power outage could knock out mail connections. It's not easy to reroute around that and plan and foresee a lot of these things. So great points, Rob. Okay.
Yeah, this one, it's, again, the emails providers focus on providing you a good experience. Well, what we see here are the technologies which made strides in email initially. We all had great hope for things like email authentication. I remember when I first heard about like DMARC, I was like, oh yeah, this is great. This is going to help prevent all sorts of things. And you get excited about some of these things, but the reality was it was just sending, kind of what we thought were known good. And so getting back to an appreciation for the creativity of the adversary, they were able to circumvent it. Now, it's not that it's a bad technology, it's still relevant. It's still a good supporting data point on whether an email phish is a phish or it isn't. But it's not the primary defense mechanism that we necessarily thought it would be. It's very supporting. And I've spent a lot of time in leveraging sandboxing and detonation and URL rewriting. And so while these technologies, they still have some value. It's not that there's no value. It's more of a, the line is going up and to the right because attacks have figured out how to circumvent these things. And so they become more sophisticated. They're targeting the human. They're not necessarily targeting, a word with a, some type of macro or an attachment. And so, they cause financial loss. And I don't know, Jim, how do you feel about these technologies?
I've been through every single one of these things, and while they have an initial benefit, I think, it's a step above what we had previously at every phase. We rapidly see that there are shortcomings to each piece, particularly around sandboxing. We've seen variable times of delay in terms of the delivery of messaging, which has a whole nother impact because at that point, your end users are understanding the names of those controls that are stopping, quote unquote, stopping their emails from being delivered. That's not a place as a practitioner you ever want to be at. You want as much as you can to keep the names of these controls kind of behind the curtain, because at that point they know whatever controls, whatever security, whatever assurance that you're providing, with email in general, is being covered, and they don't have to worry about another party to kind of interact with. And so that's all I would add. Okay, so let's talk now that we've known some of the shortcomings, we've seen where we've gone, we've seen the complexity of the attacks, we kind of understand where we are today in general. So how do we approach all these things together and build something that's a lot more modern to confront and mitigate against these types of attacks? So I think there's a number of different signals, as we've listed out here, grouped pretty broadly in breadth and in depth, but there's no one single signal that is truly deterministic when looking at specific targeted emails. And I think, to Rob's point, to some of the other points we've made before, some of these third-party controls, some of the native controls have looked at one specific signal, or maybe one or two. In this case, I think we have to take the sum total and understand that we've got to cover everything soup to nuts, both from the static variable types of information that we've seen before and the language and intent and behavioral aspects of all these attacks. So under identity, kind of straightforward, we've talked about a number of these things, understanding who we are, what role that person plays, some of the other native controls, DMARC, DKIM, SPF, looking at alternative email addresses, nicknames, signatures, the whole works. Behaviorally speaking, the communication patterns that we've seen in present and in past, the frequency in which we communicate with those specific domains, location and pattern, very critical in understanding efficacy of some of these communications, and then understanding the devices and the clients that they're most frequently using. And in language, intent and tone, urgency, authority, fear, that's all due to subtext as we talked about before. Understanding the writing styles, does this email look different than some of the past ones that sender has sent before? And then the specific topics and where the communication, that specific communication is leading towards. Is it leading suspiciously towards asking for some piece of information where in previous communications that hasn't been the case? So understanding all these signals in total and relating them to each other, critical to understanding targeted email attacks.
Yeah, security teams, I think, from my perspective, they understand identity and behavior. There's a precedent in other security business verticals where these are relevant. You think of attacks against these, typically security people see these as additional context inside of attacks. And so, this isn't necessarily a new market trend. They're vital context that you need. They additionally provide information around what happened to who and the kind of the relationships in between. But then there's the language one, and I think that one's new here. And I don't think everybody necessarily is fully up to date on the kind of the language portion. We see it every day if you're getting hit with attacks. But while it's not new, it's new to security. It's not new outside of security. Outside of security, there are a lot of really great data sets, a lot of efficacy, a lot of people have been doing this for a long time. And now is the right time to pull this into security and leverage it because, hey, guess what? The bad guys are already doing it for us. And so to be able to counter that with defensive measures that are being applied to customers, I think is definitely the right way to go.
Well said. So I think it's kind of a given at this point, given the growth in software as a service, cloud in general, that we're moving away from these out of band, I would say segregated types of implementations to an API first implementation. I think, from a speed perspective, from a seamless type of integration with any kind of control, this is truly the way of the present and of the future as well. And it leads to a number of benefits as we've listed here on the slide. It's very fast. I mean, you can deploy these types of controls within minutes. They're simple. You don't have to worry about, as I said before, you've got kind of a big change when you have to start modifying your mail exchanger records or modify specific routes and also priorities of routes as well. Whenever you can bypass that kind of configuration change, it's definitely beneficial. Compatible, obviously, to what you have already in-house and some of the native security controls or the controls within your tenancy. And then something that's going to give you a benefit, not only from cost, but time as well. So you want to be able to free up a lot of your operations folks to do some more proactive work, to kind of enhance the fact that you've got these new controls in there. So.
I see a few familiar names inside of here, so I think if you know anything about me, there's people that are actually on the list here that know I've been advocating for APIs for close to 10 years now inside of security. And hopefully, if you're not one of the people that likes APIs, you don't hold that against me. I just think, coming from a more of a software engineering background than a security background, I migrated to security. I didn't start in security. APIs just provide for richer context, user setups, and more automation. And so I think, gone are the days of having a proprietary secret sauce black box where the vendor kind of decides what you can have access to or what you can't have access to. I think APIs provide this both for operational gain and also from the security standpoint.
Absolutely. So talking about automation, how to fight some of this alert and false positive fatigue. So automation, obviously, this is kind of the Rosetta Stone of where everybody wants to go. But it's important to note that you don't necessarily want to automate every single little thing in your environment. You're looking more or less to automate those binary types of actions, right? The on-off ones. You want to be able to hand that stuff off to, machines, machine actions. I think there's always got to be at some point in the value chain some human interaction. It doesn't necessarily have to be at every point. So you want to leverage automation for those areas where there's absolutely no value in a human getting involved there. We've kind of talked about that a number of times. From a learning perspective, looking at forward-looking email threats, I think it's a foregone conclusion that we want to kind of skate to where the puck is going rather than where it is right now, and to be able to apply automatic actions to mitigate, et cetera, whenever we see these types of situations. And then sharing the load is kind of an interesting conversation that I've had in the with a lot of my peers. How much power do we want to give end users to mitigate some of their own or do some of their own triage versus how much of a load do we want to place on our ops team versus how overreaching is giving that power to the end user. It's kind of a fine line, but I think, innately we are looking to reduce the workload for all parties involved. So it's just a matter of being able to tune that to an appropriate level. So.
Yeah, when I look at the space, specifically this space, I see the ability to automate large portions. My previous jobs, I've worked on cloud SIEMs and other type of sophisticated security automation, and they were really hard. When I look at this space, I see concise data and I see concise outcomes, which means that there's a high ability to automate, so security engineers can focus on all the other challenges that they have. And the ability to also kind of have a conversation where there's going to be certain interactions where you can provide automation to lead users to the answer rather than providing them just information to help them make a decision. And so I think that, APIs are definitely a part of that. And it's something that's going to kind of help, the alert fatigue that I think everybody suffers under.
Along with balancing everything.
Yeah, exactly. So all sort of security solutions have false positives. Let's just be honest about that. Everyone on this call has implemented a security product, and then I was a customer at one time as well. And I'm of the mind of looking for security solutions that raise the bar for attackers, and to not look for security solutions that are security savers. And so the way we think about this is that you solve false positives specifically by building in multiple layers of protection with many different feedback loops, not one, not two, multiple feedback loops. It could be part of the detection, part of the response, part of data aggregation. There's large opportunity to essentially implement feedback loops, and the use case there is for tuning. And so it's been my experience that feedback loops lower false positives more so than any other mechanism. Like, you can have all the data in the world and all the context in the world, but what you have to understand is that security vendors build algorithms to address their largest potential customer base, which means the algorithms they build are typically generic. They have to be generic in order to be able to go after that broad audience. And so feedback loops are what allow you to optimize, to customize, to reduce those false positives. And so I think what's really interesting about this slide, I really liked it because I think it does a really good job of illustrating kind of the process when it comes to targeted email attacks of how you can create and where you can create feedback loops.
I would heartily agree. I think, the first question that any practitioner has is how we're going to handle false positives, knowing that there's never been a solution out there that have reduced false positives to zero. I think taking a tactical approach with logical steps in each part of that approach, at least we know we're getting it down to the utmost minimal amount. So very well said. Okay. So I'm going to share with you some of my experience in implementing the Armorblox solution. There's only a few points on here, and part and parcel of that is because it was very simple and it got to the value that I was looking for very quickly. So it's going to be a very simple discussion. The first one is that it was very quick to implement. So in minutes, using this API approach that we've talked about before. So it was almost seamless. It was seamless to our end users, and it was almost there was almost no encumbrances on my team, other than a couple of minutes of configuration time. Operationally, it's definitely freed up our ops team from a false positive perspective, which is where they were spending the majority of their remediation time. Due to the efficacy there, understanding that, again, we're not going to get every false positive 100%. It's just not going to happen. But using the approach and working with the Armorblox team, we've been able to understand why some of these things have come up in the past, where the shortcomings have been in our native controls, as we've discussed before, and coming to an area where we have an acceptable level of false positives. We all look for an acceptable level of risk, understanding risk can't be removed completely. With false positives, you have to think kind of in the same terms. A couple of examples where they caught some attacks. One was an attacker that was impersonating our CEO trying to get some wire transfers. We've heard some of these types of attacks, but we never really had an easy way to stop these. Using the Armorblox solution, this is no longer an issue anymore. It's completely obviated from our landscape. Business email compromise, kind of in the same realm, where we've had a couple of vendors or folks impersonating vendors, trying to get additional payment on a fraudulent invoice. Again, fairly well wiped out as well using the solution. The other thing that we had been struggling with for a great many years, I listed bank fraud up there, but also shipping company fraud like FedEx, UPS. We were constantly deluged with these types of emails looking for folks to enter their credentials so that obviously they could break into our accounts there. Again, we had tried a number of different approaches there. I think, from a native perspective, there's almost no defenses there if you're just using a native set of controls. It's just the way it is. We had tried some other third-party enhancements. They didn't work. We came to Armorblox, and they've been able to mitigate these at a very, very high level. So overall, a very good experience. Not a lot of time invested. We've seen the time return from our operations team. And most importantly, as I said before, none of our end users know what we're using for our email controls. You never want, as a practitioner, to let your end users know the names of those controls. That's the best mark of a successful solution.
Thank you, Jim. I'll go over the high level of the Armorblox solution now. I think you probably can imagine some of the things based off of the conversation, but Armorblox is a cloud office security platform. We're protecting essentially that human layer we've been talking about to stop targeted attacks and data loss across email messaging and file services. We connect over APIs to analyze thousands of signals and protect people and data where siloed solutions have failed. So we do inbound protection, stopping those attacks. We do outbound protection, more around the loss of sensitive data, such as PCI, PII, and encrypted passwords. And then there's the messaging protection. The similar logic. We stop malicious URLs and the loss of sensitive data. We're starting with Slack, but because APIs will be adding Teams and other platforms in the future. And then finally, for file protection, Armorblox analyzes online drives. We stop malicious URL, zero-day attacks, and then more sensitive data loss. Starting with Box on this one, additional drive solutions in the future. And here's an abstracted view of how Armorblox works. For each email, message, or file, we analyze the signals across the identity, behavior, and language we talked about before. And so Armorblox also leverages external threat feeds and global data from fraud model and detection models. These signals get processed by our detection engine. We leverage many techniques in our algorithms to stop attacks. And the spectrum of detection techniques enables Armorblox to classify both attacks and data loss at a granular level. So attacks can be classified under payroll fraud attack, an attack against a takeover attempt, a VIP impersonation, so on and so forth. And then data loss can be classified under PII, so your passport, your social security number, your PCI, so your account numbers and your IBANs, et cetera, et cetera. And then once attacks and data loss violations have been classified, our policy actions can automatically remediate these incidents. These policy actions can be leveraged straight out of the box, and they do provide for the ability to have many, many customizations. And then finally, there's the continuous learning piece. I obviously have strong opinions about this, and so there are many feedback loops that I mentioned previously in any security solution. Is bound to miss a few things and have false positives. So to minimize these occurrences, our algorithms then learn from every email, every message and input, manual action, and anything else that the security team provides back to us. And then based off of all these inputs, the algorithms are constantly recalibrated to offer better, more enterprise event relevant detection and prevent data loss. Jumping into one more layer down, since we're kind of talking about algorithms, I think it's important to point out examples. So at a high level, we have 3 tiers of essentially learning models where we combine global threat data and organizational relevance for detecting threat and data loss. So the first is the global model. Think of this one as large data sets, public data, attacks inside specific business verticals or across organizations, with the examples being something like zero-day credential campaigns and ransomware. And then next is the per organizational model. Put simply, these are specific and unique algorithms running for every organization. These models inside of the organization consider common domains internally that interact and interact within the organization with their known vendors, partner domains, and so on. And so the examples here would be things like vendor fraud, third-party fraud, payment fraud. And then finally, there's the per user model. And this is where we look for patterns or relationships for the employees in the organization. So these models consider common interactions, common domains for those users, common communication patterns and the topics discussed, and so on and so forth. And these would be examples of impersonation and account takeover. On this one of the values, you heard Jim talk about it, because we have an API method, we're easy to deploy. We connect over the APIs. It can be done in minutes. So there's no need for any MX record modifications or rerouting of email. This essentially helps you to simplify your security stack. It doesn't impact your email performance. We're easy to manage. We eliminate the need for custom policy work by providing you out-of-the-box protections, defined categories. Email threats are automatically classified under these categories. And then email is easy, we're easy to respond to threats, automatically doing remediation of threats based off of configurations, based off of every one of those categories of those configurations. And then we have automated actions that include such things as what you would expect, delete and quarantine and label and then lock out an account. And these actions can also be stacked up on top of each other. And then the ease of integration, Armorblox can also integrate over APIs. So we're open API as well. So we can integrate with things like SOARs and SIMs, any of the other tools as well. And then lastly, the Armorblox. In this particular use case, we're talking about Armorblox and how it connects to an Exchange server that's on-prem. Obviously with APIs, we can also connect with O365 and Gmail, but in this particular use case, the workflow is Armorblox. We would provide you with an Exchange connector that's lightweight, connects inside of your firewall, and it doesn't have to be on your Exchange server or your Active Directory machines. You would basically provide us to that access. Armorblox, the Exchange connector connects to pretty much all of your AD. If you are one of these mixed mode companies where you have on-prem and O365, while those are two different setups, they're API setups. You would essentially go into Graph API and Microsoft, give us what we need there, and then give us the necessary access inside of your Exchange server and Active Directory. And then the setup doesn't require, again, any MX record changes, and we do not have to be online either. We can do all of this detection, all of this prevention out of line.
All right.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jim and Rob, for the very open and informative discussion. I know that we have a few minutes still left, so happy to take any questions. I can see that there are already some questions coming up. Let's start with the left field one. This is for you, Rob. Can you throw some light on what your impressions are? You're like around 2 months old now into your Armorblox life. So why did you decide to join, and how are things now?
I had lots of conversations with CISOs, about 20 of them. And what was fun about that is, what's your problem? And pretty much for all 20 of them, like one of their top 5, there was always email. Email was coming up. I think if you look at statistics, all the different market data out there, this is the actual problem. I like to solve hard problems. So I've worked in the SIM space, hard problem there. When I look at this problem, what really interested me that I hadn't seen before is I've done a lot of algorithms, ML, AI in previous spaces, mostly around network and endpoint data, and it was actually really hard. There's not necessarily a lot of efficacy there. I think it'll get there. But what I noticed here is that natural language processing and NLU actually had a high efficacy. So it was actually both the opportunity to work on something that the CISOs care about, work on something that you can win at, and apply really cool technology that I think customers will actually appreciate. And so, having been a customer, having been on the vendor side, all those different things kind of resonated with me. There's certain things that kind of check the box off that you want to work on, and I don't like to work on things that don't provide value. The software engineering in me always wants to work on things that have impact. So all those things kind of led me here. Since I've been here, it's been great. A lot of really great customer conversations, a lot of great customer interactions, a lot of feedback, great feedback on both what we're doing and kind of the potential for this technology in the future. So all of that it's been a lot of fun the last couple of months.
Awesome. We have one more question here. It's for Jim, but Rob would love your thoughts as well. So Jim, any insight you can share from your experience with replacing security solutions? So if you have incumbent solutions that need replacing, do you do it all in one go or do you stagger it? I guess the final question here is the most relevant one, which is what factors do you consider while making these decisions?
Okay, so I think whenever we're looking at either replacing or enhancing existing security solutions, it's an exciting time. We're understanding that we may be able to gain some efficiency, some scale, be able to fill in some security gaps in general. But I think first of all, whenever we look at a new security control, we seek to gain visibility into what that control can manage. So, rather than doing a rip and replace, we first look to see the data. We kind of put it in view mode, so to speak, before we put it into any kind of actionable mode. There's a number of reasons. One, again, I'm going to come back to my previous point where we don't want our end user community to know that any of this is happening wherever possible, right? So we're looking to mitigate threats. We're looking to reduce gaps in risk wherever possible without our end user community knowing, because we don't want their work impacted. So we kind of first seek to gain visibility when we're looking at new controls, and then try to stagger them in as much as possible given the limitations of the control themselves, to stagger them in very slowly, at each point being able to roll back if something unforeseen should happen, which is rare. If you're taking enough due diligence into your migration or implementation plan, it shouldn't be that difficult.
Thank you. Rob, any thoughts from your side there for replacing?
No, I think Jim nailed it on the head. I mean, I could repeat a lot of the things he just said, but I'll go ahead and say that was a great answer.
Oh, thanks. You get one out of every hour.
Then I know we're already out of time. Some of the questions, so if does using Armorblox mean your MX records have to be changed? No, you don't have to change your MX records. I guess we have time for one more question. Rob, could you throw some more light on the detection algorithms you mentioned earlier? I know you mentioned natural language processing, but without giving away too much or going into too much detail, what is the Armorblox approach in terms of threat detection?
So explain the really hard part in 60 seconds or less. Right, gotcha. I'm going to go a little bit over just to make sure I answer this well. The important thing here is, it's important to understand that we have a right tool for the job type of approach. So if a simple tool works, then why try and make it harder than it needs to be? Our focus is on solving customer problems and not getting caught up in product marketing and buzzword terms, which are overused and left with little meaning to customers. So one way to think of this is from a data set perspective. And I just told you I have a background working with endpoint and network data sets. Using algorithms with those data sets is challenging even today. And while I think in the future best practice with certain data, with sets of data and algorithms for those will become more established, today those algorithms tend to skew more towards statistical, heuristic, and rules-based engines. And that's just the way that it is. And then, that's, actually one similar place where we actually start is statistical as well. Like there's actually is some similarity inside of there. I actually like statistical. There's a lot of relevance there. If you think of, where is an SSH connecting to, or from inside of your network to the external, IP address in Europe or China, wherever the case may be. Like statistics around that are super fun. If it's never connected before, that tells you one thing. If it's connected, it tells you something different. So, when you start talking about those patterns and profiles and baseline, they actually provide context. So statistics is interesting. But also conversely with email, the data set is completely different. So because it's different, the primary indicators for us from an attack perspective is language. And so for us, language is the security signal. And so from that perspective, in the public realm, both from academia and industry, there's a lot of prior work and trained models which Armorblox can leverage for security purposes. And you might have heard of things like BERTs or the Facebook open source project called Roberta, or some of the popular GPT type of algorithms. And to kind of put it simply, we don't have to invent the wheel. We can apply existing knowledge and efficacy, but with security contexts to detection. And so besides the statistical, we heavily leverage natural language processing, natural language understanding, and there are ML and deep learning models. But holistically, like we use sets of algorithms in order to apply to whatever customer problem there is in the best way possible in order to have the best detections that we can get for them.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, 1.5 minutes, still something I thought was impossible, but
yeah.
Great stuff.
Well done.
I know there are a few other questions, but we're already over time, so we'll try connecting with everyone else offline to answer those questions. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you so much, Jim and Rob, for all your sage advice and patience. Speak to all of you later. Thank you for attending. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jen. Take care, everybody.
Take care. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Abby. Take care.